The Hermetica. An Introduction to the Corpus Hermetica by John Michael Greer. The 15 tractates of the Corpus Hermetica, along with the Perfect Sermon of Asclepius, are the foundation documents of the Hermetic tradition. Written by unknown authors in Egypt sometime before the end of the 3rd century Common Era, they were part of a once substantial literature attributed to the mythical figure of Hermes Trismegistus, a Hellenistic fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. This literature came out of the same religious and philosophical firmament that produced Neoplatonism, Christianity, and the diverse collection of teachings usually lumped together under the label Gnosticism, a ferment which had its roots in the impact of Platonic thought on the older traditions of the Hellenized East. There are obvious connections and common themes linking each of these traditions, although each had its own answer to the major questions of the time. The treatises we now call the Corpus Hermeticum were collected into a single volume in Byzantine times, and a copy of this volume survived to come into the hands of Lorenzo de' Medici's agents in the 15th century. Marsilio Ficini, the head of the Florentine Academy, was pulled off the task of translating the dialogues of Plato in order to put the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin first. His translation saw print in 1463 and was reprinted at least 22 times over the next century and a half. The treatise divided up into several groups. The first, or Chapter 1, the Promenades, is the account of a revelation given to Hermes Trismegistus by the being Promanders, or man-shepherd, an expression of the universal mind. The next 8 chapters, or the general sermons, are short dialogues or lectures discussing various basic points of Hermetic philosophy. There follows the key, Chapter 10, a summary of the general sermons, and after this a set of 4 tractates, Mind unto Hermes, About the Common Mind, the Secret Sermon on the Mountain, and the Letter of Hermes to Asclepius, chapters 11 through 14. Touching on the more mystical aspects of Hermeticism, the collection is rounded off by the definition of Asclepius unto King Ammon, which is chapter 15, which may be composed of 3 fragments of longer works: the Perfect Sermon, or Asclepius, which is also included here, reached the Renaissance by a different route. It was translated into Latin in ancient times, reputedly by the same Lucius Apelles of Modera, whose comic serious masterpiece, The Golden Ass, provides some of the best surviving evidence on the worship of Isis in the Roman world. Augustine of Hippo quotes from the Old Latin translation at length in his City of God, and copies remain in circulation in medieval Europe all the way up to the Renaissance. The original Greek version was lost, although quotations survive in several ancient sources. The Perfect Sermon is substantially longer than any other surviving work of ancient Hermetic philosophy. It covers topics which also occur in the Corpus Hermeticum, but touches on several other issues as well, among them magical processes for the manufacture of gods, and a long and gloomy prosody of the decline of Hermetic wisdom and the end of the world. The significance of the Hermetic writings, the Corpus Hermeticum, landed like a well-aimed bomb amid the philosophical systems of late medieval Europe. Quotations from the Hermetic literature and the Church Fathers, who were never shy of leaning on pagan sources to prove a point, accepted a traditional chronology which dated Hermes Trismegistus as a historical figure to the time of Moses. As a result, the Hermetic tractates borrowings from Jewish scripture and Platonic philosophy were seen in the Renaissance as evidence that the Corpus Hermeticum had anticipated and influenced both. The Hermetic philosophy was seen as a primordial wisdom tradition, identified with the wisdom of the Egyptians, mentioned in Exodus, and lauded in Platonic dialogues such as the Timaeus. It thus served as a useful club in the hands of intellectual rebels who sought to break the stranglehold of Aristotelian scholasticism on the universities at this time. It also provided one of the most important weapons to another major rebellion of the age, the attempt to re-establish magic as a socially acceptable spiritual path in the Christian West. Another body of literature attributed to Hermes Trismegistus was made up of astrological, alchemical, and magical texts. If, as the scholars of the Renaissance believed, Hermes was a historical person who had written all these things, and if church fathers had quoted his philosophical works with approval, and if those same works could be shown to be wholly in keeping with some definitions of Christianity, then the whole structure of magical Hermeticism could be given a second-hand legitimacy in Christian context. This didn't work, of course. The radical redefinition of Western Christianity that took place in the Reformation and Counter-Reformation hardened the doctrinal barriers to the point that people were being burned in the 16th century for practices that were considered evidences of devoutness in the 14th. The attempt, though, made the language and concepts of the Hermetic tractates central to much of a post-medieval magic to the West. The translation. The translation of the Corpus Hermeticum and Perfect Sermon given here is that of G.R.S. Mead, 1863 to 1933. Originally published as Volume 2 of his Thrice Greatest Hermes, London, 1906, Mead was a close associate of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the founder and moving spirit of the Theosophical Society, and most of his considerable scholarly output was brought out under Theosophical auspices. The result, predictably, was that most of the output was effectively been blacklisted in academic circles ever since. This is quite unfortunate, for Mead's translations of the Hermetic literature were until quite recently the best available in English. They are still the best in the public domain, thus their use here. The Everett translation of 1650, which is still in print, reflects the state of scholarship at the time it was made, which is only a criticism because a few things have been learned since then. The Walter Scott translation, despite the cover blurb on the recent Shambhala reprint, "This is not the Sir Walter Scott of Ivanhoe fame," while more recent than Mead's, is a product of the new criticism of the first half of this century, and garbles the text quite severely. Scholars of Hermeticism of the caliber of Dane Francis Yates have labeled the Scott translation quite worthless. By contrast, a comparison of Mead's version to the excellent modern translation of Brian Copenhaver, or to the translations of C.H. I, Prometheus, and the seventh, "The greatest ill among man is ignorance of God," given in Bentley Leighton's The Gnostic Scriptures, shows Mead as a capable translator, with the usual solid grasp of the meaning of these sometimes obscure texts. There is admittedly one problem with Mead's translation: the aesthetic of the English text. Mead hoped, as he mentioned at the beginning of the Thrice Greatest Hermes, to render these beautiful theosophic treatises into an English that might, perhaps, be thought in some small way worthy of the Greek originals. Unfortunately for this ambition, he was writing at a time when the last remnants of the florid and pompous Victorian style were fighting it out with the more straightforward colloquial prose that became the style of the new century. Caught in this tangle, like so many writers of the time, Mead wanted to write in the grand style, but apparently didn't quite know how. The result is a sometimes bizarre mishmash in which turn-of-the-century slang stands cheek by jowl with overblown phrases in King James Bible dictation, and in which mishandled archaicisms, inverted word order, and poetic contractions render the text less than graceful, and occasionally less than readable, seen from a late 20th century sensibility. The result verges on an unintentional self-parody in places. For example, where Mead uses the Scots contraction "ta'en" for taken, apparently for sheer poetic color, calling up an image of Hermes Trismegistus in a kilt and sporran. The poetic word order is probably the most serious barrier to readability. It's a good rule, whenever the translation seems to descend into gibberish, to try shuffling the words of the sentence in question. It may also be worth noting that Mead consistently uses "for that" in place of "because," and "ought" in place of "any," and leaves out the word "the" more or less quite at random. Finally, comments in parentheses and square brackets are in the Mead original. Those in the angle brackets are my own additions.